Welcome back. For this portion, we will be slicing to the brain via the eggshell cuts that we usually see with cranial CT scans and cranial MRIs. And along the way, we will be stopping once we see a structure that is of significance, and I will give you a little bit of some clinical correlation. For example, up here in the vertex of the brain is the so-called precentral gyrus, and most of the time it is in the shape of an omega character, so the so-called omega sign. This knob of tissue corresponds to the motor cortex that controls the upper extremity, or specifically the hand. So this is the hand area of the brain. As such, this is the first reason why we teach you the central sulcus of Rolando, because this is our marker, one of the easiest sulci to identify on the external surface of the brain. So as we descend downwards, we start to see the gray matter giving way to the white matter. And that whole confluence of white matter that we see here is called the centrum semiovale. As we descend further, the centrum semiovale gives way further to the corona radiata, a set of radiating fibers just above the lateral ventricles. So while we're here, at the region of the centrum semiovale and the corona radiata, this is where all the fibers coming down or descending from the motor cortex will pass through. And this figure shows you that the fibers coming from the legs are located most medially, whereas those from the hand area are more lateral, and the ones from the face and for the mouth and tongue are most lateral. So this has implications when you have enlargement of the ventricles, when you have hydrocephalus, or more correctly, ventriculomegaly. So we stop at this area to point out the calcarine fissure or calcarine sulcus, which is the area of your primary visual cortex. So for your visual impulses to reach this place via the thalamus, coming from the optic tracts, optic chiasm, and optic nerves, it has to be transmitted in a set of fibers known as the optic radiations. Then we come down to a very easily recognized area, the area where the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the internal capsule are all found in one place. Now, this has significance in that this area is very prone to hypertensive intracerebral hemorrhages, being that this area is mainly supplied by small penetrating arteries from the middle cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery, and anterior choroidal artery and the anterior cerebral artery. Now, these two gray matter highlighted here are the so-called corpus striatum. These are the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Together, they form the major inputs for the basal ganglia circuitry, which is in charge of the checks and balances in our motor activities. Speaking of checks and balances, the globus pallidus, which lies medial to the putamen, is very much in charge of supplying inhibitory impulses, as we shall see later. So these checks and balances are very important, and the globus pallidus internal segment and the external segment have a very big role to play in this very complex circuitry called the basal ganglia circuitry. Housing the basal ganglia is the island or the Isle of Ryle, also known as the insula. It is very much a part of your brain that controls how intense you feel about things. The basal ganglia is not purely just to do with motor activities. It also has to do with cognition and emotions. So the very concept of self-inhibition versus compulsion tells us that the basal ganglia circuitry have very much to do with our being civilized people. Further evidence that the basal ganglia really have a lot to do with compulsion versus motivation is that the the same structures also mediate the opposite of hate, which I showed earlier. So the concept of romantic passion, the concept of being in love, all of these point to a set of checks and balances inside our brains, inside our minds, all mediated by dopamine. I mentioned earlier that the insula houses the basal ganglia in the internal capsule. Other structures inside include the claustrum, a small sliver of gray matter between the gray matter of the insula, the white matter underneath, called the extreme capsule, and the white matter underneath the claustrum, called the external capsule, which caps the basal ganglia. This mysterious piece of gray matter seems to be connected with all parts of the cerebral cortex and elsewhere. This connectivity leads us to postulate that it is maybe the seat of consciousness. It could be the seat of vigilance, of being aware of what's going on. Now, with thinner slices, we are able to see the brain as a whole because the brain that we see when we do brain cutting is not what it seems. What we can see here, the brainstem and the diencephalon and the gray matter and the white matter are all interconnected. Now with the finer cuts, we can now look again at the coronal slices of the brain and see other structures that string things together. For example, as we approach the basal ganglia from anteriorly, as we will see in the next few slides, that's the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle, and then that is the caudate and the putamen joined in front by the nucleus accumbens. As we can see, the nucleus accumbens is part of the pleasure systems of the brain. And as the basal ganglia appear, in this cut we see the anterior commissure and right below it the basal nucleus of Maynard. Now why is the basal nucleus of Maynard important? The basal nucleus is practically the reason why you're all still in medical school, why you're still slaving through reading all those trends and sitting through all those online lectures. Or it should be the reason why. Because here is the seat of wanting to learn, of wanting to know more about finding what's new, what's real, what's important. Basically, everything you need to know to grow as a person, to learn new things, to change for the better, depends on your basal nucleus of Maynard. But what activates the basal nucleus of Maynard? It is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But that is the subject of another lecture. Basically, it's all about brain plasticity, neuroplasticity. Now, while we're here, in your temporal lobes anterior to the hippocampus, in front of the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, lies your amygdala. Now, this is a seat of fear and anger, as well as other things. Being in control and being able to regulate your own emotions, this needs more control measures. And this manifests in the secretion of neuropeptide Y in your amygdala, which is in turn secreted in other nearby structures such as the hypothalamus. Meanwhile, above the hypothalamus and below the thalamus is the missing piece in the basal ganglia circuitry. This is the subthalamic nuclei, or the subthalamic nuclei of Lewis. The subthalamic nucleus of Lewis forms a more direct pathway from the cerebral cortex to the basal ganglia circuitry, hence the term hyperdirect pathway. And here you have the most handy tool a medical student will ever have in memorization, the hippocampus, which takes charge of short-term memories. So as you reach the posterior part of the brain on the coronal, you see the tail end of the thalamus, which contains your lateral geniculate nuclei and your medial geniculate nuclei, which subserve vision and auditory stimuli, respectively. And then you have the splenium, and then the occipital lobe with its calcarine sulci.